But in particular, they decided to make a part called Arguments to be a discussion. Now, 2 years later, they have another national convention. But notice the first one, they reject it. They say, civil rights only, don't blur class consciousness, nothing specifically Jewish, no focus on Yiddish. The next time it says, the convention recognizes the fact that Russia, consisting of a great number of disparate nations, needs to be reorganized in the future into a federation of national groups, each having full national autonomy, independent of the territory where they reside. The boundaries don't matter. It's the ethnic groups that should get to define this. And the convention deems the term nationality applies to the Jewish people. So it moved very fast to accepting the need of defining Jewishness in a national ethnic way. They point out, at the time it's sufficient to fight for the abolition of all discriminatory laws against the Jews and to protest against a future oppression of the Jewish people. At the same time, it says, the Bund will refrain from inflating nationalist feeling among the Jews, which can blur the class consciousness of the Jewish proletariat and lead to chauvinism. So again, don't distract them. And they even have a marvelous paragraph on Zionism and what they think about Zionism. The convention regards Zionism as a reaction of the bourgeois classes to the phenomenon of anti-Semitism and the abnormal civil status of the Jewish people in Russia. The ultimate goal of political Zionism, a territory for the Jews, is an object of little value because such territory would contain but a fraction of the whole nation and thus not solve the Jewish question. Hence, to the extent the Zionists seek to concentrate the whole of the Jewish people or a majority of the Jewish people in a single land, they pursue a utopian goal. That was the other big insult you could offer in a socialist environment. One was bourgeois, the other was, you're a utopian. I know exactly what's going on. Our workers' paradise is fact. But your bourgeois nation, that's utopian. And furthermore, the convention believes Zionist propaganda inflames nationalist feeling and hinders the development of class. So again, as much as they say, yes, 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 we're a nation, they're primarily focused on class consciousness and not distracting them with bourgeois nationalism. But by the Sixth Party Convention in 1905, they say explicitly that the Jews should have the right guaranteed by law to use their own language in all legal and governmental institutions. Item number 3, national cultural autonomy on an extraterritorial basis. The removal of all functions connected with cultural matters, like popular education, from the responsibility of the state and local government, and the transference of these functions to the Jewish nation. Jews should be able to run their own Jewish schools using the Jewish language and Jewish cultural content, and the government should have nothing to do with it. This is really a nation within a nation. This is ethnic national rights. And they raise the question, by the way, who gets to vote? And what I love about this is one of the first examples that I know of Jewish self-identification being the standard for who is a Jew. These functions will be organized in the form of central and local institutions whose officials will be elected in general elections by all those who identify themselves as belonging to the Jewish nation by an honest, secret ballot. No mother being Jewish, no father being Jewish, no ketubas, no pedigree, no synagogue membership. Anybody who is crazy enough in Tsarist Russia to sign up and say, I am Jewish, can vote in this election.
I don't remember my Russian history well enough to know what was going on in Russia in the intervals between those two congresses. For example, if there was a great series of pogroms, maybe their attitudes changed as a result.
There were.
Yeah.
There were a series of large pogroms in the early 1900s. Also in 1905, there was a short-lived revolution against the Tsar that created a Duma, a parliament, that was ultimately shut down. So there was optimism that some change could happen against the will of the Tsar. But in particular, I mean, even the conferences in 1899 were after massive waves of pogroms in the 1880s. So it's not as if they still had a naive desire to fully integrate into Russian society. They really were looking for a revolutionary change because they didn't accept an integrationist model. The challenge was how much to argue for Jewish identity. Now, some of it is also the argument on the street, because the Zionists are also making progress at this time. And so some of their readoption of Jewish ethnic identity is in some ways a response to that street dialogue and the competition for votes and attention and volunteers and so on that they're having with the Zionist ethnic nationalism, which is resonating for Jews living in Russia. So now in the Eighth Party Congress, you've gone even further in 1910. It's only 11 years from the first one. But here it says, they believe that it's very important to raise the following demands. Number one, the division of languages between dominant and tolerated is unacceptable. Number two, all government institutions must use the local language when dealing with the local populations. Jump down to number four. Until the realization of national and cultural autonomy, which transfers responsibility to educational and cultural matters to the nations themselves, there must be a government school for each national group in the general population in which its own language will be used. And it points out, in this struggle to achieve this demand, we must secure the rights of the Yiddish language, which is denied these rights more than any other language, and moreover is not even officially recognized, while other non-dominant languages receive at least partial recognition. And they admit they still have reservations that this Jewish nationalist Yiddish trend may blunt the class consciousness of the Jewish proletariat. But nevertheless, considering the interests and need of the proletariat, we must conduct the struggle against the assimilationists and the Hebraists, so that the Yiddish language will acquire in all areas of Jewish public life, especially schools and cultural institutions, the prominent position it merits as the national language of the Jewish people. The note says, adopted unanimously. So imagine how far they evolved in just that 10, 11-year period between we don't want anything to do with Yiddish special focus, it's going to blunt class consciousness, to now advocating for Jewish national cultural autonomy under the umbrella of the Russian Empire, the right to use their national language for schools and to have their own schools, and to advocate for the Yiddish language as their defining feature of Jewish identity, against the assimilationists and against the Hebraists or the Zionists. And it was unanimously adopted. So there you can see how the Bund has changed even in that short period of time to celebrating what you could call a Yiddish nationalism, or an ethnic identity built around Yiddish language and ultimately Yiddish culture. Now we have to remember that Yiddish in Yiddish means Jewish. It doesn't mean Yiddish. The way you would say Yiddish, the language in Yiddish, would probably be Mamalosh, mother tongue. But Yiddish means Jewish. So when they say Yiddishkeit, they don't mean Yiddishness, or Yiddish language, or Yiddish culture. Yiddishkeit in Yiddish means Jewishness. Kite in German or in Yiddish is like a quality of being, as opposed to, an ideology or belief system. So for them, their Jewishness was who they were, but that included culture, language, lived experience. And many of these Jewish cultural and Yiddishist organizations were secular by default. In fact, the word for secular in Yiddish, anyone know the word for secular in Yiddish? It's often weltlich.
What?
Weltlich. Weltlich means worldly. And that could have a sense of this worldly, right, secular, but also it could have a sense of universal, cosmopolitan. So the weltliche Yiddische Schulen were secular Jewish schools, but they were also more open-minded, universal. You can hear the socialism and the cosmopolitanism echoing here. But they weren't always strictly secular. What they did in the community was secular because they had some atheists, they had some religious people, they were focused on Yiddish culture. But the common denominator was being non-religious. So they might write alternative Yiddish pieces rather than change the Hebrew ones. My mother remembers a song she learned in her shul called Mir Benchen Dilich, which is what they would sing when they led holiday carols. She used to sing it every Passover, so I know. Mir Benchen Dilich, Lechovetem Heilig Yom Tov. We light these lights in honor of the holy holiday. But rather than change the Hebrew and argue over whether you can change the Hebrew, they would write a new piece in Yiddish. So it felt Jewish, but it was not theological. There was no God in that text. So that was their solution to being secular, was do something new that wouldn't be religious. And if you wanted to do the old blessings, you could. If you want to have a bar mitzvah, do it somewhere else. You want to go to Rosh Hashanah services, do it somewhere else. We don't do those. But if you want an ethnic, cultural Jewish experience, that's what these communities and these schools would provide. And for them, the key focus was on Yiddish language and and Yiddish literature. And I'll point out to you to, again, look it on your own, a piece in here that's also in our anthology, Judaism in the Secular Age, by Chaim Jadlowski, who was a major advocate for secular Jewish identity in America, and in particular for Yiddish language. He believed very strongly that Yiddish language could preserve a Jewish cultural identity through multiple generations, because it would connect you to your past, in its reliance on Hebrew, in its evocation of the old country in Eastern Europe, and also because it was your present. It was the language that you were speaking, that your children were speaking, and ideally that their children would be speaking too. In Eastern Europe, this Jewish Yiddish nationalism was often expressed with the desire, as the book put it, for cultural autonomy. Let us have our own papers, let us have our own schools, let us run our own educational and cultural systems. In fact, under the Soviets at one time, they did actually create a Jewish autonomous region in eastern Siberia called Birobidzhan. Birobidzhan, there's actually a documentary called Mazel Tov Comrade Stalin, which explores the history of Birobidzhan. And I mean, Stalin made this in 1932 to get the Jews as far away from him as he could, as he put them on the far side of China. It's a long ways away. It was marshland, and it was Siberia in the winter, and it was a big mess. But there were some tens of thousands of Jews who moved there because they saw this is a socialist paradise. Yiddish was an official language there, Yiddish and Russian. You can still go there, by the way. The train station has Birobidzhan in Yiddish and in Russian on the marquee. Street signs have Yiddish and Russian names. And it was a Soviet style of Yiddish. So sometimes what the Soviets would do to support Yiddish was they liked the idea of it as the people's language, right, not the elite's language. They didn't like Hebrew. Why not Hebrew? It's religious and it's Zionist. So it's bourgeois nationalist. But Yiddish is the people's language. Of course, the dilemma is there's a lot of Hebrew in Yiddish. I mean, you know, for example, the word for book in Yiddish, there's two words for book. One is a buch, which comes from the German, just an ordinary book. The other is a sefer. The sefer, from the Hebrew word sefer, is more of an elevated book, a religious book, a holy book, an important book. And you have to read it correctly, you'd have to know the Hebrew, because they don't put the vowels in the same way as when you're writing Yiddish. So the Soviets actually changed the spelling of Yiddish to cut out the Hebrew words, and rewrote everything so that it would be phonetic and wouldn't have any reliance on Hebrew knowledge at all. Now, it is easier, if you're learning from scratch, to learn the Soviet Yiddish, because it's all phonetic. You don't have to learn, well, this word is pronounced this way, this word is pronounced that way, even if it doesn't look like Austria-Hungary, which had all these nationalities under it. And then they went into fighting each other, and what we call Balkanization is named after the Balkans for a reason, because of all those different ethnicities that wanted ethnic self-determination. And so this was part of the, as I say, part of the zeitgeist in Europe at the time, and so the Jews were caught up in that. And if the Poles can demand Polish nationalism and their own ethnic rights and ultimately their own political state, and Ukrainians can do that, and Lithuanians can do that, and Estonians can do that, and Hungarians can do that in the context of the Austro-Hungarian. Why not the Jews?
At what time did the internal passports arise in the Soviet Union?
It was way back in the Tsarist era.
That goes way back.
Well, yeah, I mean, there were some examples of that earlier. You would know more as a Russian specialist. But the marking of it with a Jewish identity, at one time, you would have thought the Bolsheviks would have let that go.
Yeah.
And they wouldn't have done that. But in fact, that persistence of ethnicity, even in the Soviet paradise, sort of gave the lie to that universalism they had hoped would be the case.
It's actually considered not an ethnicity, but a nationality.
Right.
That's called the fifth line, Punkt. And the Soviet Jews come here. There's a joke that says they had to come to America to become Russians.
Right.
Realize they were Russians. Yeah.
The Jews had to come to America from the Soviet Union to become Russian before they weren't.
Russian.
They were just Jews.
The other thing is that in the early years of the Soviet Union, they went back and forth on the nationality question. It became, I don't know if political football is the right usage there, but it was an issue that was used by different factions within the party to compete with one another for the support of various.
Right. So in the 1920s, for example, they had a Jewish section of the Soviet government called the Yevsektia, the Hebrew section, And it sponsored Jewish plays, Jewish literature, Jewish newspapers, Jewish textbooks. And then in the 1930s, it was all shut down, or the Stalinist crackdown. But for a time, there was a flowering of the Soviet Yiddish culture, finally enacting this Jewish cultural autonomy they've been talking about for decades. And one of the challenges in Yiddish culture, of course, is when you get into the 1920s and 30s and 40s and 50s, if you're raising a second and third generation of a secular Yiddish culture, are they going to be an Apikoros who knows the religious past we left behind? Or are you going to be raising an Am Ha'aretz who just doesn't get it anymore and doesn't understand why Sholem Aleichem is funny, or why Paris is, what does he mean, kosher mouse meat? What's he talking about? They just don't get the jokes after a couple of generations. And ultimately, of course, the dilemma for Yiddish in America was that America is where foreign languages come to die. I mean, after 2 or 3 or 4 generations, it's very hard to maintain as a living, fluent language any foreign language. I mean, people still send their kids to Swedish camp and to Norwegian camp, but it's episodic. It's a flavor. It's not the same as a living language where you could read a journal printed in that language, which is what the aspirations of the Yiddishist movement were to have. And why did that happen in America? Again, a few factors. The restriction of immigration in the early 20th century, 1919, and then again more strictly in 1924, cut off the flow of new native Yiddish speakers coming to America. So finding good teachers and having that flow of, oh, my uncle just came, he still speaks Yiddish, go talk Yiddish to him, and you practice it that way. That stopped at a certain point. And then, of course, it was destroyed after the Holocaust. Some survivors, in small numbers, but nothing like the millions who used to be there, and produce literature, and consume literature, and write poetry that you could print in both New York and in Poland. That was gone. And so that was a body blow to Yiddish language. A second challenge to doing Yiddish as a cultural identity for secular Jews was Zionism and Israel. After the founding of the State of Israel, you want a Jewish language that has prestige. Is it going to be the diaspora language in which Jews suffered and died in the Holocaust? Or the new Jewish language that brought back Jewish pride by fighting back and founding a state? Not to mention the association with religious tradition and history and legacy and all that. And so Hebrew became much more prestigious as a Jewish language. And in fact, the Zionists themselves were very anti-Yiddish. There were episodes of actually bombing kiosks that sold Yiddish newspapers in the state, not by Arabs. These were by Jews who were promoting Hebrew and said, that's the diaspora language, that's the passive old Jew language, we need to move forward. One example that was mentioned at a conference the Institute held some years ago, a Yiddish paper wanted to come out as a daily paper. And they were told that they were unable to do so because they didn't have the correct movable type to make a Yiddish paper. Now, if you know anything about Yiddish, it's written in Hebrew letters. I think in Israel they couldn't find Hebrew type that they could use for this paper. So in the end, what they did was they came out with one paper that had one name on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, and another paper on Tuesday, Thursday, and Sunday. Same editorial staff, same writers, different name on the paper. So they had a, half weekly and half weekly, and that's how they managed. But you can see the institutional resistance to doing anything in Yiddish in Israel. And so that also contributed to a decline in Yiddish. I mentioned the integration to America, where the first generation is fluent, the second generation understands it, third generation knows the swear words, and the fourth generation mispronounces the swear words. and then you lose it.
So following up on that, the last time I was in Israel, I was interested to hear an Israeli say, we're not Jewish, we're Israelis.
You get that population sometimes too.
Jews are victims, and Israelis aren't victims.
Right, or you get the, that also has to do with religious identity, because for many Israelis, Jewish equals religious, equals Orthodox, and Israeli equals secular, equals modern. So there's a whole dynamic in that as well, right?
I've never quite understood why it is that since most Eastern European Jews were in Poland and Russia and other places east of Germany, that this German dialect became the Jewish lingua franca.
Well, unfortunately, that's a topic beyond what we can cover today. It's medieval history and how Jews migrated. And I commend to you, provocative people, a secular history of the Jews to pursue that learning. Sorry, I got to move on. I just wanted to point out as well, another factor in the decline of Yiddish and Yiddishism was what we talked about earlier with Jewish socialism. You know, in the McCarthy era, if speaking Yiddish was identified with being on the left, and all these socialist schools were the ones teaching Yiddish, well, if the socialist schools declined, so too do the Yiddish schools and the Yiddish knowledge in the general population. So it has a sort of mutually reinforcing effect. There's some discussions of a renewal of Yiddish interest recently, whether it's the revival of klezmer music or the proliferation of courses in Yiddish language at universities. There's now a National Yiddish Book Center, which was actually started because everyone was throwing out their Yiddish books. If you read the story of Aaron Lansky, who helped to found the center, he would get a call from somebody saying, my grandpa died and he had all these old Yiddish books, I'm going to chuck them. Do you want them? And he would show up with crates and throw them in the back of his car, and that's how he started the National Yiddish Book Center, to save these books that were just getting thrown out because nobody could read them anymore. And now they've digitized large numbers of these books. If you go on their website, you look at all kinds of Yiddish books, and it may make no sense to you, but they're all there, and if you could read Yiddish, you could read them.
Steven Spielberg put up the money.
Spielberg paid for the archive.
The ultimate joke, right?
Yeah, right. Now, the challenge is, of course, is this a renewal? Well, people aren't talking to their babies in Yiddish. They are in the Orthodox world, by the way. Ironically, the most prevalent fluent Yiddish speakers you'll find out there are in these ultra-Orthodox communities that use it as a barrier to assimilation. They want the kids to only know how to read and write and speak in Yiddish, so they can't learn English. So they can't read the newspaper or the internet. It's a way of maintaining control.
It's also because Hebrew is the holy language, and they won't speak or use Hebrew except for praying.
That's right. In fact, there was a... Oh, is this shut up? Am I dead? I'm dead. All right, I'll talk loud. The other challenge is that ultimately, there's only so far you can go in breaking that, in setting up that barrier. So in Israel, for example, they have people around them all the time. So some have come to different accommodations on that. In America, they can make those lines really very strict. So whether or not it's a renewal of Yiddish language, it's a revival of interest as a curiosity. But I'm not so sure it's the same as a revival of the language in the way the Yiddishists imagined that it would be. So what kind of roots do we draw from the Yiddishist experiment? Well, we understand that you can identify with your culture in many ways, including language, including literature. It doesn't, again, have to only be religious ideology or religious sources. It can be new literature and not just old literature. At the same time, it's important to be creative and write new things. Don't only sing old songs or rework old songs. Articulate your own beliefs and your own values in language that speaks to you. And the final example is that we can also encounter Jewish culture in translation. The vast majority of Yiddish literature is not going to be read by us because we're not going to learn Yiddish in order to read those works. But there is this wonderful thing called translation that can give you access, not perfect, not the same, mediated through the translation, but still experiencing something of the reason why these books were popular and the reason why Jewish identity was reinforced by that content and that literary and cultural creativity. So I included a couple examples of poems in here, one from Italian, one from Yiddish. You also have the Pious Cat came from Yiddish. There's a lot of other examples out there. And the translation issue is dramatized very beautifully in a short story by Cynthia Ozick called Envy, or Yiddish in America, where she imagines two Yiddish writers. One is a stand-in for Isaac Bashevis Singer, the other is a stand-in for Jakob Gladstein. Gladstein was a better poet and a more artful Yiddish writer, but Singer had a good translator, and so he was more well-known. And the story is told mostly from the perspective of the Yiddish writer. Gladstein is a better writer, but he's just torn with envy because here's this guy with his shtick and his dibbiks and his magic and his sex and this vulgarian who's so famous for his Yiddish when I know his Yiddish stinks. It's the dilemma of quality over popularity. But in the end, part of the dynamic is he has a translator. His Yiddish is not better, but his marketing is better because it can be translated to the audience that can actually read it. And so we have to be open to reading those translations and learning from the kind of identity formulation that was part of the Yiddish Literature Project. That we can't read the Yiddish, but at least we can read the translations.